How angels may be protecting your home right now, and you don't even realize it, because there are moments when something feels wrong inside your house. No noise, no visible danger, but the atmosphere changes. The anxiety gets heavier. The fear comes out of nowhere. The tension keeps building for no reason you can explain. And deep down, you start wondering if there's a battle happening around you that your eyes can't see. What if the nights you felt protected? The moment's disaster almost happened but didn't. The unexplainable peace that suddenly covered your family were never coincidences at all. What if angels have been standing guard over your home this entire time, and you've ignored the signs? You may not say it out loud very often, but there are nights when your home does not feel peaceful, even when everything looks normal on the outside. The lights are off, the doors are locked, the world around you has gone quiet. Yet inside your mind, something keeps moving. Your thoughts keep circling around problems you cannot solve, fears you cannot fully explain, and possibilities you wish you could stop imagining. You try to rest, but your heart stays alert, as if it is waiting for something bad to happen. Sometimes it begins with a small thought, a sudden fear about your family, a worry about the future, a sense that something feels heavy in the atmosphere around you. Other times, it is harder to define. You just feel emotionally tired, spiritually drained, mentally crowded. Your body is inside your home, but your mind never fully settles there. And what makes it harder is that you believe in God. You believe He protects. You believe He cares. You have prayed. You've asked Him to watch over your family, your mind, your house, your future. But if you are honest, there are moments when fear still feels louder than faith. That creates a conflict inside you that few people see. Because part of you says, God is with me, but another part whispers, then why do I still feel afraid? You may even feel guilty for struggling this way. You hear verses about peace. You hear messages about trust. You hear people speak confidently about faith. Meanwhile, you're trying to silence thoughts at 2 in the morning while wondering why anxiety keeps finding its way back into your heart. What many people never realize is that fear is exhausting not only because of what it says, but because of what it constantly asks. What if something happens? What if I lose control? What if God does not intervene? What if I am missing warning signs? What if my family is not protected the way I hope they are? Fear always demands certainty about the future. And because no human being can fully control tomorrow, fear keeps searching for evidence that something is wrong. That is why anxiety can quietly enter a home, even when everything appears stable on the outside. Not because the walls are unsafe, but because the mind has become overwhelmed by invisible pressure. You can love God deeply and still battle these thoughts. You can pray sincerely and still struggle with overthinking. You can trust God and still feel emotionally tired. Sometimes the hardest battles happening inside a home are the ones nobody else can hear. And maybe what has troubled you most is not only the fear itself, but the silence. You prayed for peace, yet the heaviness remained. You asked God to calm your heart, yet your thoughts kept racing. You hoped for immediate reassurance, but heaven seemed quiet. That silence can become dangerous if it is misunderstood. Because when God does not respond in the way you expected, fear immediately tries to interpret the silence for you. It tells you that God is distant, that you are unprotected, but you are alone in what you are carrying. But silence and absence are not the same thing. One of the deepest misunderstandings people have about God is believing that if they cannot immediately see His activity, then He must not be working. But throughout Scripture, God often worked in ways people could not fully recognize in the moment. His protection was real long before it became visible. The Bible repeatedly shows that angels are sent according to God's will as servants carrying out His purposes, not as the center of attention, but as evidence that heaven is more active than human eyes can see. And maybe that matters more than you realize tonight, because your greatest fear may not actually be danger itself. Your greatest fear may be the feeling that you are facing life alone. That feeling changes the atmosphere of everything. It changes how you sleep, how you think, how you speak to the people you love. It changes the emotional environment inside your home. Fear slowly trains your mind to expect darkness even in ordinary moments. You begin listening for bad news before it arrives, You begin preparing emotionally for pain that has not happened. You begin carrying tension in rooms that were meant to hold peace. And eventually, your home may still look calm, while your inner world feels constantly under pressure. But what if something important is happening that you cannot fully see right now? What if God's presence has never depended on your ability to feel emotionally secure every moment? What if heaven is not absent simply because your emotions are unsettled? The truth is, many people imagine God's protection as the removal of all discomfort, all uncertainty, and all struggle. But that expectation creates confusion because life still contains difficult seasons. Problems still appear. Anxiety still tries to speak. Hard nights still happen. So then the question becomes deeper. If fear still exists, does that mean God is not protecting you? If you still feel vulnerable, does that mean heaven is silent? Or could it be possible that God's protection works in ways far more unseen than you expected? That question matters because your entire spiritual atmosphere changes depending on how you answer it. If protection only counts when you can visibly measure it, then fear will always dominate your mind whenever life feels uncertain. But if God can be faithfully present, even when you cannot immediately see what He is doing, then maybe your situation is not as abandoned as fear keeps telling you. Maybe there are prayers already being answered that you have not recognized. Maybe there are dangers you never saw because God intervened before they reached you. Maybe there are moments where heaven has quietly guarded your life without announcing itself. And maybe the peace you are searching for will not begin when every circumstance changes. Maybe it begins when you stop assuming that silence means you are alone. One of the reasons fear becomes so powerful inside a home is because it convinces you that peace can only exist when every problem disappears. So you keep waiting for the perfect circumstance. The financial pressure must end. The tension in the family must stop. The uncertainty about the future must finally become clear. The health concern must resolve. The unanswered prayer must finally receive an answer. Only then, you think, will your heart finally rest. But if peace depends entirely on perfect circumstances, then peace will always remain fragile. Because life in this world will never stay completely predictable for long. This is where many people quietly misunderstand the nature of God's protection. Protection does not always mean the absence of difficulty. Sometimes it means the presence of God in the middle of difficulty. That difference changes everything because fear constantly tells you to measure God's faithfulness by what you can immediately see happening around you. But Scripture repeatedly points people back to something deeper: God's presence itself. Not perfect circumstances, not total control, not visible certainty. His presence. The reason this matters so much is because your mind naturally searches for visible evidence of safety. Human beings want reassurance they can touch, explain, and predict. But faith often grows in places where control becomes impossible. That is uncomfortable for the human heart because control feels safer than trust. And yet some of the deepest spiritual growth happens precisely when you begin realizing that God's care is not limited to what your eyes can currently understand. Throughout the Bible, angels appear as servants carrying out God's purposes according to His will. They are never presented as independent sources of power or objects of worship, but as reminders that heaven is active even when human beings cannot fully see what is happening. That matters because fear narrows your vision until all you can see is what threatens you. Faith expands your vision until you begin remembering that God may be working beyond what you can currently detect. There are moments when your mind becomes so focused on visible problems that you stop noticing invisible grace. You stop noticing the prayers that were quietly answered, the situations that could have become worse, but did not, the strength you somehow had during difficult days, the wisdom that arrived at the right moment, the comfort that appeared when you thought you would completely fall apart. Fear rarely acknowledges those things because fear survives by keeping your attention fixed on danger. And maybe that is why anxiety becomes so spiritually exhausting. It constantly pulls your attention away from God's nearness and toward worst-case scenarios that may never happen. You start mentally living inside futures that do not even exist yet. You rehearse conversations that have not happened. You imagine disasters before there is evidence of them. You carry emotional weight for tomorrow while still trying to survive today. Eventually, your nervous system stays in a constant state of alertness, even inside the place that should feel safest to you. But here is something important many people overlook. The presence of fear does not automatically mean the absence of God. Sometimes people think mature faith means never feeling afraid. But throughout Scripture, even faithful people experienced fear, uncertainty, waiting, and emotional exhaustion. The issue was never whether fear tried to appear. The deeper question was whether fear would become the loudest voice guiding their hearts. Because fear always speaks urgently. Fear says panic now. Fear says prepare for disaster now. Fear says God may not come through. Fear says you are vulnerable and alone. And if those thoughts repeat long enough, they begin shaping the emotional atmosphere inside your home. Not just internally, but relationally. Anxiety affects how you speak, how you react, how you carry tension into conversations, how you respond to stress, how you treat moments of silence. People often think spiritual atmosphere is only about dramatic spiritual experiences, but much of the atmosphere inside a home is formed through daily thoughts, words, attitudes, and emotional patterns. A home filled with constant panic eventually feels heavy. A mind consumed by fear eventually struggles to recognize peace, even when peace is available. That is why protection is not only about what happens around your home, it is also about what is happening inside your mind. And this is where prayer becomes different than many people imagine. Prayer is not merely an emergency signal sent upward during moments of panic. Prayer is an intentional returning of the heart to truth. When fear pulls your mind into chaos, prayer slowly pulls your attention back toward God's presence. Not because every circumstance immediately changes, but because your perspective begins changing. You begin remembering that God is not reacting nervously to your future. You begin remembering that His awareness is not limited by your uncertainty. You begin remembering that silence does not mean abandonment. And maybe that last truth is one you desperately need to hold on to. Because some of the most emotionally difficult seasons happen when God seems quiet. You ask for immediate relief, but the answer feels delayed. You ask for clarity, but confusion lingers. You ask for visible reassurance, but nothing dramatic happens. That is often when fear becomes aggressive. It interprets delay as rejection. It tells you that if heaven were truly active, you would already see undeniable proof. But what if God's greatest work in this season is not happening around you first? What if it is happening within you? What if He is teaching your heart to rest before circumstances fully change? What if real spiritual maturity is learning that peace does not come from controlling everything, but from trusting the one who remains faithful even when life feels uncertain? That does not happen instantly. Trust usually grows slowly, especially for people who have been emotionally exhausted for a long time. And perhaps that is why God's protection is often quieter than people expect. Fear wants dramatic signs, but God frequently works through steady presence, daily grace, subtle guidance, unseen intervention, and the kind of faithfulness that only becomes fully visible when you look back later. Right now, you may still feel tension. You may still feel questions. You may still wonder why peace does not come easier. But what if the very fact that you are still standing, still praying, still seeking God, and still holding on to faith after everything you have battled is itself evidence that you are more held by God than you realize? And what if heaven has been closer to your home all along than fear has allowed you to believe? The hardest battles are often the ones nobody else can see. Not because they are small, but because they happen silently inside the mind. You may look calm to everyone around you while internally carrying constant tension. Your thoughts rarely stop moving. Even during ordinary moments, your mind searches for danger, prepares for disappointment, and anticipates problems before they happen. Sometimes you do not even realize how exhausted you are until your body finally slows down and the weight of everything catches up with you. Fear has a way of becoming a constant mental background noise. It follows you into quiet rooms. It follows you into conversations. It follows you into prayer. And eventually, it even follows you into your own home. That is why the battle inside your mind matters more than you may realize. Because whatever consistently controls your thoughts eventually shapes your atmosphere. If fear dominates your inner world long enough, your home can begin feeling emotionally heavy even when no obvious crisis exists. Not because God has abandoned you, but because anxiety slowly changes the way you interpret everything around you. You become more sensitive to bad possibilities than to God's faithfulness. You become quicker to expect danger than peace. You become more aware of uncertainty than presence. And the longer this continues, the more difficult it becomes to rest. This is one reason Scripture repeatedly speaks about the importance of the mind. Not because thoughts are unimportant details, but because thoughts shape direction. What you consistently meditate on eventually influences your emotions, reactions, and spiritual stability. Fear understands this very well. That is why anxious thoughts rarely arrive all at once. They usually enter gradually. One worried thought becomes another. One fearful possibility leads to 10 more. One moment of uncertainty becomes an entire imagined future. And suddenly you are emotionally reacting to situations that have not even happened. Your body begins carrying stress created by possibilities instead of realities. This is exhausting because the human mind was never designed to carry endless imaginary futures at the same time. Yet many people live this way every day. You may even convince yourself that constant worrying is a form of protection. If you stay alert enough, maybe nothing bad will surprise you. If you mentally prepare for every outcome, maybe you can avoid pain. But overthinking does not create peace. It only creates the illusion of control while quietly draining your emotional strength. And eventually, fear begins affecting not just your thoughts, but your spiritual perspective. You start interpreting silence as abandonment. You start interpreting uncertainty as danger. You start interpreting delayed answers as rejection. This is where many believers become trapped emotionally. They love God, but they no longer know how to rest in Him. Their minds stay in survival mode, even while their faith says they are safe in His care. That internal contradiction creates deep exhaustion. Part of you wants to trust. Another part keeps preparing for disaster. Part of you believes God is near. Another part keeps asking why you still feel afraid. And maybe one of the most frustrating parts is that fear often sounds reasonable. It does not always appear dramatic or irrational. Sometimes it disguises itself as responsibility, awareness, or caution. It says you are simply being realistic. But there is a difference between wisdom and constant torment. Wisdom pays attention. Fear obsesses. Wisdom prepares responsibly. Fear never stops panicking. Wisdom acknowledges problems. Fear magnifies them until they consume your peace. That is why learning to guard your mind is not optional for spiritual health. It is necessary, not because every fearful thought immediately disappears, but because you begin learning that not every thought deserves agreement. This is where prayer becomes deeply important again, not as a performance, not as a ritual designed to force God to act, but as a realignment of the heart. Prayer interrupts the cycle of panic. It slows the mind long enough to remember what fear keeps trying to erase, that God is still present, that His authority is still greater than your uncertainty, that your future has not slipped outside His awareness, that your home is not unseen by heaven. And maybe this is where many people misunderstand spiritual peace. They assume peace means the complete absence of troubling thoughts. But often, peace begins before thoughts fully calm down. Peace begins when truth becomes louder than fear. That process takes time, especially if your mind has spent years rehearsing anxiety, especially if you have lived through painful experiences, especially if disappointment has trained you to expect more pain. Fear builds patterns inside the mind, and those patterns do not disappear overnight. But neither does God abandon you while you are healing. Sometimes spiritual growth looks less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes it looks like choosing trust one thought at a time, choosing not to feed panic, choosing not to let fear narrate every situation, choosing to speak differently inside your home, choosing to stop agreeing with hopelessness. Because the atmosphere inside a home is shaped by what repeatedly fills it. Constant negativity changes people. Constant fear changes people. Constant panic changes people. But truth changes people too. Peace changes people too. Prayer changes people too. And perhaps this is why Scripture consistently points believers back toward renewal of the mind instead of surrender to fear. You cannot always control which thoughts first enter your mind, but you can learn which thoughts deserve permission to stay. That matters because fear always wants permanent residence. It wants to become the dominant voice in your life. It wants your home filled with emotional tension. It wants anxiety to become normal. It wants you spiritually exhausted. But God never intended fear to rule your inner world. This does not mean wisdom disappears. It does not mean you ignore reality or pretend problems do not exist. Real faith is not denial. Real faith simply refuses to give fear the highest authority. And maybe that is where your struggle has quietly been shifting lately. Not in your circumstances yet, but in your awareness, you are beginning to realize that some of the heaviest battles inside your home are not external at all. They are internal. The battle over what you will believe. The battle over which voice you will trust. The battle over whether fear or truth will shape the atmosphere around your life. And perhaps the reason this matters so deeply is because unseen battles often produce unseen victories too. Every time you pray instead of spiraling further into panic, something changes. Every time you return your attention to God instead of surrendering fully to fear, something changes. Every time you choose trust while uncertainty still exists, something changes. You may not fully see it immediately, but spiritual stability is slowly being built inside you. And maybe the peace you keep searching for is not going to arrive as one sudden emotional moment. Maybe it will grow quietly as your mind slowly learns that God's presence is more trustworthy than your fear. There is something humbling about realizing how much of life happens beyond your awareness. You do not see every danger that never reached you. You do not see every moment God quietly redirected something. You do not see every prayer answered in ways that looked ordinary at first. And perhaps that is difficult for the human heart because we naturally want visible proof. We want certainty we can measure. We want reassurance that removes all doubt immediately. But God often works in ways that require trust before understanding. That truth becomes especially important when talking about angels and spiritual protection. Many people either ignore the subject completely or become consumed by fear and fascination about the unseen world. Yet Scripture presents angels very differently than human imagination often does. They are not the center of the story. God is. Angels appear throughout the Bible as servants carrying out the will of God, reminding people that heaven is active even when human beings cannot fully see what is happening. And maybe that matters more than you realize, because fear keeps demanding visible evidence that you are safe. But much of God's protection has always been invisible. Think about how many times you only understood God's faithfulness after the season had already passed. At the time, you felt confused. At the time, you thought heaven was silent. At the time, you questioned whether God was near at all. But later, when you look back, you realized there were moments of guidance, restraint, provision, protection, and strength that you could not fully recognize while you were inside the struggle. That pattern appears throughout life more often than people notice. God frequently works quietly, not because He is absent, but because His goal is deeper than simply controlling circumstances around you. He is also shaping trust within you, and trust grows differently than fear does. Fear grows through obsession. Trust grows through surrender. Fear grows by demanding control. Trust grows by learning God remains faithful, even without complete visibility. This is why spiritual maturity is often less dramatic than people expect. It is not always built through extraordinary experiences. Sometimes it is built in ordinary nights where you choose not to let fear completely consume your heart. Sometimes maturity looks like continuing to pray even when emotions feel heavy. Sometimes it looks like refusing to agree with hopelessness. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace before circumstances fully improve. And perhaps this is where your perspective begins changing. Because maybe the greatest evidence of God's protection is not that you never experience difficult seasons. Maybe it is that His presence keeps sustaining you through them. Fear says, if God were protecting me, nothing difficult would happen. But Scripture never promises a life without hardship. Instead, it repeatedly points people back to God's faithfulness within hardship. That distinction matters, because otherwise every painful season will convince you that heaven has abandoned you, and fear is eager to make that argument. Fear wants you to interpret every delay negatively, every silence negatively, every uncertainty negatively. It wants your mind trapped in suspicion toward God. Because once fear controls your perception, even blessings become difficult to recognize. You become emotionally trained to search for threats instead of grace. And eventually, your home reflects that internal atmosphere. Conversations become heavier. Rest becomes harder. Small problems feel overwhelming. The future feels constantly unsafe. But what if your home was never meant to be governed by fear's atmosphere? What if part of spiritual growth is learning that peace is not the denial of reality, but the refusal to let fear dominate reality? That changes how you live. Because once you begin believing God is truly near, your reactions slowly change too. You stop needing constant signs to believe He cares. You'll stop assuming silence means abandonment. You'll stop expecting panic to protect you. And slowly, your heart begins resting again. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. One of the most important shifts happens when you stop asking, "Why can't I see everything God is doing?" and begin asking, "Can I trust Him even when I cannot?" That question reaches deeper than circumstances. Because the truth is, human beings were never meant to carry the burden of seeing and controlling everything. That responsibility belongs to God alone. Fear makes you feel responsible for outcomes you cannot fully control. Trust reminds you that God sees beyond your limitations. And perhaps that is why Scripture repeatedly points people back toward God Himself, rather than toward fear of the unseen world. Even when angels appear in biblical moments, their role always directs attention back to God's authority, God's faithfulness, and God's care. The deepest security has never been in angels themselves. It has always been in the God who commands heaven. That truth protects your heart from two extremes. One extreme is ignoring spiritual reality completely. The other is becoming consumed by fear about unseen things. Neither produces peace. Real peace comes from knowing God remains sovereign, whether you can currently see His activity or not. And maybe tonight, that is the truth your exhausted heart most needs to hear. Not every silence means abandonment. Not every delay means rejection. Not every unseen thing is dangerous. God may be protecting your life in ways you cannot currently measure. There may be prayers already answered that you have overlooked because the answer did not arrive dramatically. There may be moments of intervention you never recognized. There may be battles you never knew were prevented. And perhaps one day you will look back and realize heaven was far more active around your life than you understood at the time. But for now, maybe faith means learning to rest before you have all the explanations. Maybe peace begins when you stop demanding visible proof for every moment of God's faithfulness. And maybe the reason your heart has been so exhausted is because fear convinced you that you had to carry responsibilities that only God was meant to hold. Fear does not only affect your thoughts. Over time, it affects the atmosphere of your home. Not necessarily through dramatic moments, but through repeated emotional patterns that slowly shape daily life. A restless mind creates restless conversations. Constant anxiety creates emotional tension. Unspoken fear changes the way people respond to each other. And eventually, a home can become filled with pressure, even when nobody intends for it to happen. This is why protecting your home is about more than physical safety. It is also about what continually fills the environment emotionally and spiritually. What repeatedly enters your mind eventually influences your words. What repeatedly fills your words eventually shapes your atmosphere. And what shapes your atmosphere eventually affects everyone living inside it. That truth can feel uncomfortable at first, because it means spiritual peace is not only something you pray for occasionally, it is also something you intentionally cultivate. Many people ask God for peace while continuously feeding fear every day. They rehearse worst-case scenarios constantly. They speak hopelessness repeatedly. They allow panic to dominate their thinking. They absorb negativity without boundaries. And then they wonder why rest feels so distant. But peace grows differently. Peace requires truth. Peace requires trust. Peace requires returning your attention back to God when fear tries to pull it somewhere else. This does not mean pretending problems are not real. Real faith never asks you to deny reality. It asks you to place reality beneath the authority of God instead of beneath the authority of fear. That shift changes how you live inside your own home. You begin becoming more aware of what you allow to shape your thoughts. You begin noticing how often fear tries to control your conversations. You begin realizing that panic is contagious. But peace can be contagious too. One calm person grounded in truth can change the emotional atmosphere of an entire room. And perhaps this is why Scripture repeatedly points believers toward things like prayer, gratitude, truth, wisdom, encouragement, and these are not small spiritual habits. They shape environments. Your home is affected by what consistently enters it emotionally. Constant anger changes a home. Constant criticism changes a home. Constant fear changes a home. But constant truth changes a home too. Consistent prayer changes a home too. Consistent peace changes a home too. Sometimes people imagine spiritual warfare only in dramatic terms while overlooking the daily battles happening inside ordinary thoughts and conversations. Yet many spiritual struggles begin quietly inside the mind long before they appear outwardly. Fear says speak panic immediately. Truth says pause before agreeing with fear. Fear says assume the worst. Truth says remember God's faithfulness. Fear says your future is unsafe. Truth says God is already present in the future you cannot yet see. And the voice you repeatedly agree with becomes stronger over time. This is why guarding your home also means guarding what repeatedly shapes your heart. Not perfectly, not obsessively, but intentionally. Because your mind absorbs what it repeatedly consumes. If your thoughts constantly revolve around danger, chaos, outrage, negativity, and panic, your inner world eventually reflects those things. Your nervous system remains tense. Your emotions remain unsettled. Your home begins carrying emotional heaviness. But when your attention repeatedly returns to truth, prayer, gratitude, and God's presence, something else slowly begins happening. Your reactions soften, your breathing slows, your mind stops spiraling as quickly. Your home begins feeling calmer again, not because every external problem disappears overnight, but because fear is no longer being given unlimited authority over the atmosphere. And maybe this is important for you to hear. Peace is not weakness. Some people cling to anxiety because they believe constant worry proves they care deeply. But panic is not proof of love. Fear is not proof of responsibility. Sometimes true spiritual strength looks quieter than people expect. It looks like remaining grounded while uncertainty still exists. It looks like speaking hope while waiting for answers. It looks like refusing to let fear dominate your family. It looks like choosing trust repeatedly, even when emotions fluctuate. And perhaps this is where your home slowly begins changing. Not through one dramatic emotional moment, but through daily spiritual decisions. The decision to pray instead of spiraling. The decision to speak peace instead of panic. The decision to stop rehearsing disaster constantly. The decision to remember that God's presence has not left your life. Because eventually, you begin realizing something important. Fear never actually made you safer. It only made you more exhausted. It stole rest from moments that could have been peaceful. It turned ordinary evenings into mental battles. It convinced you to carry burdens you were never designed to hold alone. And maybe that is why Jesus repeatedly invited people into rest instead of constant striving. Not passive irresponsibility, but spiritual rest. The kind of rest that comes from knowing God remains faithful even while life still contains uncertainty. That kind of peace changes the atmosphere of a home. People begin feeling safer emotionally. Conversations become lighter. Prayer becomes more natural. Hope becomes easier to recognize. And perhaps the greatest shift happens internally. You stop asking every day, what if something bad happens? And you begin asking, what if God is already here, sustaining us more than I realize? That question slowly weakens fear's authority. Because fear survives by keeping your attention trapped in imagined futures. But peace grows when your attention returns to God's present faithfulness. And maybe your home does not need perfection in order to become peaceful again. Maybe it needs a heart willing to stop allowing fear to speak louder than truth. Maybe it needs someone willing to create space for prayer instead of panic. Maybe it needs someone willing to believe that God's unseen presence is stronger than the anxiety trying to dominate the atmosphere. And maybe that someone is you. One of the most difficult truths to accept is that God's protection does not always look the way you expected it to. Sometimes you prayed for the situation to disappear, but instead God gave you strength to endure it. Sometimes you asked for immediate answers, but the season of waiting continued. Sometimes you hoped peace would arrive quickly, but your heart still had to walk through uncertainty for longer than you wanted. And during those moments, fear starts asking painful questions. If God is protecting me, why does this still hurt? If God is near, why do I still feel vulnerable? If heaven is active, why does life still feel difficult? Those questions are deeply human, because pain naturally makes people search for explanations. But one of the greatest misunderstandings about faith is believing that God's faithfulness can only exist where hardship does not. Scripture never teaches that faithful people will avoid every difficult season. Instead, it repeatedly reveals that God remains present, sustaining, guiding, and strengthening people even inside uncertainty. That difference matters more than you realize. Because if you expect protection to mean a life without struggle, then every painful moment will convince you that God has failed you. But if protection can also mean preservation, guidance, strength, restraint, wisdom, comfort, and unseen intervention during hardship, then suddenly you begin recognizing God's faithfulness in places fear previously overlooked, and maybe that is exactly what has been happening in your life. Fear keeps focusing on what still feels unresolved. But what if God has already been carrying you through more than you understand? Think about everything that could have completely broken you by now. The stress, the emotional exhaustion, the uncertainty, the disappointments, the nights where your thoughts would not slow down. And yet somehow, even after all of it, you are still here seeking God, still praying, still hoping, still listening. That matters. Because fear wants you to overlook the evidence of God's sustaining grace simply because everything has not become easy yet. But survival itself can be evidence of His presence. Not because you are strong on your own, but because God has quietly sustained you in ways you could not fully measure while you were living through them. Sometimes people only recognize God's faithfulness after they leave the season they once thought would destroy them. During the struggle, all they could see was confusion. Later, they realized God never abandoned them at all. And perhaps that is part of what mature faith begins to understand. God's silence is not always inactivity. His delays are not always rejection. His unseen work is still real work. This is especially important because fear constantly demands immediate explanations. It wants every question answered now. It wants certainty now. It wants visible guarantees now. But faith grows differently. Faith learns to trust before understanding arrives fully. Not blindly, not irrationally, but relationally. Like a child slowly learning that a loving father remains trustworthy, even during moments the child cannot fully understand. And perhaps that is the invitation God has been placing before you lately. Not simply to believe that He exists, but to believe He remains faithful, even when life feels unclear. That is a deeper kind of trust. Because anyone can feel secure when circumstances are predictable. But spiritual maturity develops when you continue leaning toward God while uncertainty still exists. That does not mean you never feel fear again. It means fear no longer becomes your authority. You stop allowing anxiety to define reality. You stop letting panic interpret every silence. You stop assuming vulnerability means abandonment. And gradually, something changes inside your heart. You begin realizing that God's presence was never dependent on your emotional state. There were days you felt strong. He was there. There were nights you felt overwhelmed. He was there. There were moments your faith felt steady. He was there. There were moments you struggled deeply. It was still there. And perhaps This is where the deepest transformation begins. Not when all fear instantly disappears, but when truth becomes more trusted than fear. That changes the atmosphere inside your home. Because once your heart begins resting in God's faithfulness, fear slowly loses some of its power to dominate your thoughts. You no longer need to predict every outcome. You no longer need to mentally rehearse disaster constantly. You no longer feel responsible for controlling everything beyond your reach. Instead, you begin placing those burdens back into God's hands. That is not weakness. That is surrender. And surrender is often where real peace finally begins. Many people resist surrender because they think letting go means becoming passive. But biblical surrender is not passive at all. It is actively trusting God more than your fear. It is saying, I do not understand everything happening right now, but I refuse to believe God has abandoned me. That statement carries tremendous spiritual strength, especially during difficult seasons, because fear always wants final authority over your interpretation of reality. Fear says the silence means God is absent. Fear says the waiting means He does not care. Fear says the uncertainty means you are alone. But truth says something different. Truth says God's faithfulness is not fragile. Truth says His presence is not limited by your emotions. Truth says heaven is still active even when your eyes cannot fully see it. And maybe right now, that is the shift beginning inside you. You are no longer asking only, why is this happening? You are beginning to ask, can I trust God even here? That question changes everything because it moves your faith away from transactions and toward relationship. Not I will trust God only if life becomes easy, but I will trust God because His character remains faithful. Even when life feels uncertain, that kind of faith creates deep peace over time. Not instant emotional perfection, but steady spiritual stability. And maybe you are finally beginning to realize something your fear never wanted you to understand. You were never carrying your life alone. At the beginning of this journey, fear kept asking one painful question. Am I alone? That question may have followed you through sleepless nights, anxious thoughts, stressful seasons, and quiet moments when your home no longer felt emotionally safe. It may have shaped the way you looked at the future, the way you prayed, the way you interpreted silence, because fear always tries to convince you that God's quietness means distance. But now you can begin seeing something differently. God's presence was never absent. Simply because your emotions felt overwhelmed. He was there in the nights you could not calm your thoughts. He was there in the moments you felt emotionally exhausted. He was there during the prayers that felt unanswered. He was there even when fear kept trying to become the loudest voice inside your mind. And perhaps one of the deepest spiritual shifts happens when you stop needing constant visible proof in order to believe God is near. Because faith is not learning to see everything. Faith is learning to trust the one who already does. That does not mean every question disappears immediately. It does not mean life suddenly becomes predictable. It does not mean difficult seasons never return. But it does mean fear no longer holds the highest authority over your heart. You begin understanding that your deepest security has never been in perfect circumstances. It has always been in God Himself. Yes, Scripture reveals that angels serve according to God's will, and that heaven is more active than human eyes often realize. But the greatest comfort is not angels alone. The greatest comfort is the faithful presence of God behind every act of protection. Guidance, restraint, comfort, and care. That truth changes the atmosphere inside a home. Because once you truly begin believing God is present, fear slowly loses its power to dominate every room emotionally. Your thoughts begin softening. Your reactions begin changing. Your heart begins resting. Not because you suddenly control the future, but because you realize God already holds it. And maybe this is the peace your soul has been searching for all along. Not a life without uncertainty, but a life where uncertainty no longer separates you from trust. That kind of peace is quieter than panic, but stronger. It does not scream. It steadies. It allows you to breathe again. It allows your home to feel lighter again. It allows your mind to stop carrying burdens it was never meant to hold alone. Perhaps now you can finally see that fear promised protection, but only created exhaustion. It made you constantly alert, constantly tense. constantly preparing for problems that often never arrived. But God invites you into something different. Not denial, not passivity, but trust. The kind of trust that says, even when I cannot fully see what God is doing, I believe He is still faithful. That is where emotional healing often begins. Not when every circumstance changes overnight, but when your relationship with fear changes. You'll stop feeding it constantly. You'll stop allowing it to narrate every future possibility. You stop assuming silence means abandonment, and slowly, truth becomes louder. You begin remembering that God has sustained you through every season so far. You begin recognizing moments of grace you once overlooked. You begin noticing how many times He carried you when you thought you would collapse emotionally. And perhaps one day you will fully understand just how protected you truly were during seasons when you felt most vulnerable. But even now, before every answer arrives, peace can still begin. Because peace is not the belief that nothing difficult will ever happen. Peace is the confidence that God will remain faithful no matter what happens. That changes the way you live. It changes the atmosphere of your home. It changes the way you speak. It changes the way you pray. It changes the way you face the future. And maybe tonight, instead of asking, what if something goes wrong? Your heart can finally begin asking a different question. What if God has been nearer than I realized this entire time? Because He has. Through every fearful thought, through every anxious night, through every uncertain season, through every moment you wondered whether heaven was silent, God was still there, still watching, still sustaining, still caring for you in ways seen and unseen. And perhaps that is why your story is not ending in fear. It is ending in trust. Not perfect trust overnight, but deeper trust than before. The kind of trust that allows a weary heart to finally rest. So tonight, let your home breathe again. Let your thoughts slow down again. Let prayer become a place of peace instead of panic. And when fear tries to return tomorrow with all its familiar questions, remember this: God's protection is not fragile. His presence is not temporary. And His faithfulness does not disappear simply because you cannot currently see everything He is doing. If this message spoke to your heart, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can continue growing together in faith and truth. And wherever you are right now, may this truth stay with you long after this video ends. You are more held by God than fear wants you to believe.